What is the price of freedom? Is it the loss of security? Is it the burden of solitude or the weight of difficult choices? In other words, what does it really take, or what are you really willing to do? Who are you really willing to be or to become in order to truly be free? These are the kinds of questions that Gao Xingjian addresses in the novel One Man's Bible. So, before I talk about this book, I need to talk about the author, because the author and the book are pretty tightly intertwined. Now, in case you can't guess, the author Gao Xingjian is Chinese, and I have to apologize that my Chinese is pretty bad, and I have a particular difficulty with that name, Xinjian. So, if you're a Chinese speaker out there, I apologize. I'm doing the best I can. But I do have genuine admiration for this author and this book, which is why I'm going to talk about it. Gao is best known in the West, I use air quotes there, for his novels Soul Mountain and One Man's Bible, which is the book that I'm going to talk about here. It's important to understand a little bit about his background before we talk about this book, because it adds another whole nother dimension to the book, or it really adds a lot of depth to the book. He was born January 4, 1940 in, and I have to look at the name here, Ganzhou, China. Not Guangzhou, but Ganzhou, China. And he was later naturalized as a French citizen, and we're going to get to that when we talk about his life here. Although he's an accomplished novelist, he's a well-known novelist in the West, he's better known as a playwright and a director. And in fact, he's also well known as a translator, which is something he started doing in middle school. In middle school, he was translating works of English literature or English language literature into Chinese, which is pretty commendable, I think. If you think about it, he would have been maybe 10 years old, so that would have been 1950. So imagine a 10-year-old in 1950 China translating English literature, English language literature into Chinese language. No internet, no electronic dictionaries or anything like that, just using his own skills and paper dictionaries and things that he had on hand. So that's a pretty amazing skill right there. As a playwright, he was a pioneer of absurdist drama in China, and he had a unique approach of combining traditional Chinese storytelling and folklore with absurdist frameworks and stories, particularly the work of Antonin Artaud. His plays were very popular in China until 1989, when he wrote, published, and then staged a play titled Fugitives, which openly criticized the government at that time, openly criticized their response to protests and a political reform movement. And if you know your history, or you can do a little Google foo, you can figure out more specifically what I'm referring to here. Unfortunately, his criticism was seen as unpatriotic and a threat to society. All of his work was banned in China, and he was also expelled from the country. So let's pause for a second here and let's just think about this. So the year is 1989. I don't think anyone really had anything resembling the modern internet at the time. So that would have meant that published work would have been words printed on paper. Remember those things? So he wrote a play, published it, had it staged, and then the government decided that that play was too critical of government policies and decided to ban all of his work and kick him out of the country. And they also took away his citizenship. He's no longer a Chinese citizen. That's why earlier I said he's a naturalized French citizen. But imagine that. So we have two things that I think are really profound there. And I know this is a bit of a tangent, but I think it's something that's very interesting and it's very relevant to what's happening in the world today. Imagine a published work being so profound and critical that a government decides not only should that work be banned, but all the work of the author, and the author should be kicked out of the country. So you've got a society that takes published work very seriously. So that must be a literate society. And you've got a dramatic work that contains highly critical content, so much so that a government decides that it simply cannot exist. That's a pretty profound thing. So it must have been one hell of a play, and he must be one hell of a writer, in my opinion. And he actually is. So moving forward, in the year 2000, he received the Nobel Prize for his body of work that had been published up until the year 2000, which is an award I did not know existed until I did this research on him. And I think that's a pretty damn cool reward. Imagine that you get a Nobel Prize award, not just for one thing you've written, but everything you've written. That's pretty profound, I think. So let's talk about this book, One Man's Bible. This is a semi-autobiographical novel that explores memory, survival, and exile within two time frames. One would be during the Cultural Revolution of China, and then one would be contemporary Hong Kong, or the contemporary world. And at this time, I mean, the book was published in the late 90s, so it would have been in that time frame. The story follows an unnamed Chinese playwright who is in Hong Kong. In present day, he's in Hong Kong, and this is just before the Hong Kong handover from colonial ownership, which is a weird thing to think about. Britain controlled and basically owned Hong Kong, but in 1997 it was returned to China. So he's in Hong Kong kind of on the eve of that, and he's overseeing production of a play that he's written. And at this time in Hong Kong, he reconnects with an old lover, a woman named Margaret, who is a Jewish woman of German descent, who has, her life has been directly impacted and shaped by the Holocaust. So there's some interesting parallels there. They have an intense week-long affair in a hotel room, and this triggers memories that he has of his past during the Cultural Revolution. Some of this is through conversations that he has with Margaret, and some of it is just recollections and recounts and just his own memories. And so this kind of forces him to confront a time in his past, or basically his entire past, that he has tried hard to distance himself and to forget. So the novel shifts between two perspectives. The present-day narrative is told from second-person point of view and uses you, which is very interesting. And you is an exiled writer, kind of drifts between, I guess you could say, sanctuary cities, or cities where he can be, where he will not be politically persecuted, where he feels that he cannot, where the reach of Beijing cannot get him. And the past is written in the third person perspective using the pronoun he. Again, no names. He is a young man struggling to survive during the beginning and kind of into the peak of the Cultural Revolution in China, and he has to deal with all the chaos and social upheaval that happens at that time. It's of particular difficulty for him because he is a writer, and being an artist and a writer at that time was pretty dangerous. There were a lot of restrictions and a lot of scrutiny and persecution within the arts at that time, as there were in many careers and fields and throughout society, but there was a particular focus on the arts. So because of this persecution, he has to adapt his behavior in order to survive. So in the beginning, he kind of just blends in with the crowd, and he kind of just tries to be a nobody and really downplays and distances his work as a writer. When people ask him, how to write a book or write novels and things like that, he always just says, "So you don't want to do that. That's a waste of time. I used to do that before, but it was just silly. It's nonsense, whatever." Eventually, as he kind of matures a bit, because the Cultural Revolution takes a long time. It's not it's quite interesting how many years the Cultural Revolution went on for. But he becomes a rebel leader. And when I say rebel leader, I mean he's rebelling against, or he's rebelling with the Cultural Revolution, with the Maoist communists. So rebelling against the existing with the existing government at the time and the existing society, because the Cultural Revolution sought to upturn all of that. So he basically joins the Cultural Revolution and becomes a leader within the revolution. However, he does this out of self-preservation, not because of he feels any sort of profound affinity for the ideology. So it's a very interesting thing to sort of wear that mask and support that revolution and that ideology purely as a means of self-preservation. So it's very interesting, and that's not an uncommon story within the times of the Cultural Revolution. Eventually he manipulates his circumstances, he manipulates some relationships with people, and he moves out of the city into the countryside where life is, ironically, where life is a lot easier. There's less scrutiny, things are easier, there's more food and things like that. So beyond political repression, the novel really explores themes of sexuality and control, exile, and freedom, which I referred to earlier. In both timelines, the past and in the present, so the past during the Cultural Revolution and the present, which is kind of the lead up to the handover of Hong Kong to China, the protagonist of You and He really is navigating the state's restrictions and society's restrictions on intimacy and relationships. And particularly, like, we see this with, like, he has a lot of secret encounters with friends, with women. There's a lot of coercion that goes on his behalf and on other people's behalf. Sometimes he's coerced into relationships, again, as a kind of manipulative thing. There's a lot of fear of surveillance and power dynamics, and all of the things really kind of pervade and define his experiences. In fact, early on, I think in just the first few pages of the book, as he's going to the hotel to meet Margaret, he knows he's going to sleep with her. They only have this kind of friends with benefits type relationship. But while he's kind of looking forward to meeting her and to being intimate with her, he's at the same time, kind of simultaneously, he's ruminating over not will he be surveilled, but how will he be surveilled? Will there be cameras planted in the room? Will there be a microphone in the telephone receiver? Or will there be someone in the building across with a really high-powered binoculars or scope trying to watch him? So it's kind of it's a weird juxtaposition that goes on. And also, like, during the Cultural Revolution, relationships and intimacy really can become acts of rebellion and patriotism. And sometimes he engaged in relationships that were not sanctioned by the Communist Party. So that would have been a sort of an act where a relationship, or even just like in a sexual encounter, could be seen as illegal, basically. As a result, his relationships are really just transactional, and we see that in the present narrative with Marguerite, where he constantly tries to evade her when she tries to connect with him emotionally. He doesn't want to have that connection, he just wants physical connection. So, which kind of leads to this, what I've just discussed there leads to something I think is important to look at here, that One Man's Bible while it does give a pretty harrowing and difficult description of time of life during the Cultural Revolution, it's not really a commentary on the Cultural Revolution. There isn't direct commentary on things that happened or on decisions that were made and how they impacted people's lives. It's just a thing that's happening. Sometimes it's just in the backdrop or in the background, but that direct commentary is not there. It's up to the reader to infer for ourselves, if we want to do that. But the book itself is not a commentary on the Cultural Revolution. Instead, it's a commentary on one person's desire and struggle and what they will do and commit to in order to achieve freedom. And the protagonist is so committed to freedom. He wants political freedom in the sense that he wants no political ideology. He's not for or against any political ideology. He wants no political ideology. He wants to be emotionally free. He doesn't want to be connected to anyone. I mean, when his family dies, he just basically kind of moves on from there. He doesn't really feel a strong pull to family and to friends. And artistically, he also aims to be completely free. There are a few instances where people ask him about his work and about his plays, and he basically just doesn't want to talk about what they mean. He says the work is there, and it's up to you to derive or bring meaning to it. So this ultimately leaves him really rootless, and he kind of floats between cities. He floats between hotel rooms. He's got no true home, no true family, no true friends. So in a sense, he is free, ultimately free. Now the book has a really non-linear narrative, and I think that mirrors the sense of displacement, and it adds to and creates a sense of displacement. So the book is at times an intimate memoir, and at times a much broader meditation or examination of memory, of the past and how we remember the past, of trauma, of the burden of living through change, and the consequences of living through change, and the consequences of choices that people make during those kinds of times. So it's not a perfect book, despite my glowing review of it here. There are some challenges for readers, and I had some challenges with it too. The one big challenge I had with it that you may have, if you're not familiar with Chinese history, Chinese culture, and not just the history of the Cultural Revolution, but the deeper history of China, sometimes it can be a pretty challenging book, and there's a lot of stuff that you can miss. It's pretty rich in that sense. I often sense that there's a lot of symbolism that I was aware, this probably symbolizes something, the color of a person's shirt, or a particularly regional accent that he notices. I'm sure that had some significance and meaning that I just was not quite aware of, because I just didn't have the knowledge to bring to it. So if I have some knowledge, but if you have no knowledge, you might find it challenging. That's not to say that you shouldn't try it and read it, and I think you should try it and read it, and you might use this as a jumping off point to go ahead and learn some of those things. Like I said before, it has a very non-linear structure. Even within a particular scene and within just one paragraph, he can move through different points of time very quickly. And sometimes that's kind of off-putting. I found that I was fortunate to kind of read it straight through without much interruption over the course of just a couple of days. But I also got the sense that if I had put the book down for a day or two and then come back to it, that might have been a difficult thing because of the very non-linear structure to it. Another thing which I kind of commented on before, but I just wanted to talk a little bit more about too, that I think could particularly be challenging for some readers, is that although it's set in the Cultural Revolution, it's set in that time, and the Cultural Revolution is a part of the story, it's not a commentary on the Cultural Revolution. And very early on, the protagonist makes it very clear to the reader that he has no ideology. He takes no stance one way or the other on the things that happened. Even extremely difficult times when he didn't have food, he doesn't have paper to write on, people don't have fuel for heating and things like that. It's just told very almost detached and in a distance way, and that might be frustrating for some people. If you're looking for a book that has commentary on the Cultural Revolution, this is not the book for that. So, also, the nature of the relationships that the narrator has is they're, like I said before, they're very transactional relationships, particularly his relationships with women. He uses women often, he manipulates women quite often for his own preservation. At the same time, he is also manipulated by women, so he's not alone in that. And particularly during that time of the Cultural Revolution, it was not uncommon for people to manipulate each other. It's not uncommon in these times either. So, but if that's something difficult for you to read about, this may not be the book for you. So I want to talk about some of the themes that kind of underpin the book. It's kind of three of them, really. One is that the protagonist plays multiple roles. He is a victim of persecution. And at the same time, he becomes a rebel leader. But he does that as a means of self-preservation. And ultimately, he's more of a detached observer of life, largely because he's chosen self-preservation. So his personal survival strategy for self-preservation, he uses writing and independent thought as a way to kind of resist the enforced conformity of the new society that is emerging out of the Cultural Revolution. And I find that to be really, really interesting and really fascinating. And his he has a Gao Xingjian has a really profound way of playing with words. So the title of the book is One Man's Bible. And on the face of that, you could think that it means there's one man and he has a Bible. Not a really odd thing, right? A lot of people have Bibles. But the real meaning of it is that you are your own God and your own follower. And again, this goes back to the complete rejection of ideology. So it's the complete rejection of any kind of organized religion or ideology. And I think he's chosen Bible as kind of like the pinnacle of ideology, right? So if you are your own God and your own follower, you are a completely independent unit. You are not linked ideologically, spiritually, or physically, or politically. You're just emotionally, you're not linked to anything else. You are a self-sustaining unit. You are completely free. So, and I think that's a pretty interesting thing. The theme of being in exile. His previous book, the book previous to this that he published, is called Soul Mountain. It's a very famous book. I will do a review on that soon. I need to reread it. It's an amazing novel, but it's more about, that book is more about internal exile, whereas this book is more about global exile or displacement from your culture and from your past. And we literally have a character who's just kind of drifting through the world. So we have a character who has freedom, but is also rootless. And the narrator is kind of unbound to anything and at the same time alienated from everything. So those are kind of interesting juxtapositions. To give kind of some final thoughts or maybe a final interpretation, like I said, this is more than just a memoir of the Cultural Revolution. It's really a philosophical exploration of exile, of identity, of human existence, of the value of relationships and choices. Also too, it really highlights tension between personal freedom and societal constraints. Not social constraints, but societal, so society's constraints. And is there a way to find a balance between that, or do you have to choose one or the other? In this case, the narrator has chosen personal freedom, which to such an extent that he has exempted himself from all constraints of society. And that kind of raises some ethical questions, like who is this person then? We also have ethical questions in the book about memory, about detachment from past, and I'm going to kind of get to that at the end here. But another really big thing is the role of literature. And I think that this is an interesting book to compare to Stoner by John Williams, which is a book that I was greatly critical of in a video, and I laugh at that because it's not a bad book, I just didn't like it. But in Stoner, John Williams, the character of Stoner, is a man who chooses a world of literature over anything else in life. And we have the same thing in One Man's Bible. This unnamed narrator, this you and this he has chosen to be a writer and to be a free writer over everything else in life. And similar to Stoner, he is detached, he is alienated, he has no other links to the world. So I personally think One Man's Bible is a better book than Stoner, but that's another topic for another video. So last thing, we have some unanswered questions. So according to One Man's Bible, what is the price of freedom? Which is the question I raised at the beginning. It could possibly be alienation, detachment from your own past, detachment from your own memories. And I think that that raises another question that is not answered in the book. You can read it yourself and try to derive an answer for it. But the question is, if you don't have a past, who are you?